The lumen hum is the first sound I remember, the way it vibrated in my teeth before the alarms began. The air tasted of copper and promethium ash, and the Vox relays were choked with prayer and static. I had been sealing the southern blast shutters when the sky changed color. One moment pale dawn over the manufactorum fields. The next the heavens bled fire. They said the order had been given by someone far above our station, a decree so absolute that even the Emperor's silence seemed to echo it. I did not yet understand what it meant, only that every breath I took might already belong to history. The metal beneath my boots trembled as if the world itself was trying to recoil from its fate. By the Omnissiah's circuits and the Emperor's hollowed light, if my Vox reaches you across the void, mark this record with faith. Preserve it, that others may remember how a single world burned and why we still whispered prayers into the ash. The lumen hum has become a rhythm in my bones, the pulse of the manufactorum itself, whispering beneath the screech of conveyor chains and the sizzle of molten ore. I used to take comfort in it, the steady communion between man and machine. But that morning it faltered just once, a single missed beat in a chorus that had never failed in 17 cycles. I remember pausing with my hand on the coolant valve, feeling the tremor run through the ceramite plating of the wall, a shiver as if the machine spirit itself had drawn breath in fear. Then came the smell, ozone and char sharp as burnt blood, and the air began to hum in a different tone, a deeper vibration that set the teeth on edge. The Vox relays flickered alive with static and half-spoken prayers. That was how I first heard the word. Not from a man, not from an officer, but from the broken mutter of the machine itself. Exterminatus. I didn't understand it, not immediately. Words that high in sanction aren't meant for the likes of us. But the moment I heard it, my flesh chilled. The tech adept beside me, Brother Halix, turned his augmetic ear toward the Vox and frowned. Then, without speaking, he made the sign of the cog with trembling fingers. When the transmission repeated, half swallowed by distortion, it wasn't the voice of any mortal authority. It was the voice of a protocol older than our service, older than our manufactorum, older perhaps than the city itself, cold, absolute, and final. We sealed the smelter lines first. Halix was reciting Binharic prayers under his breath, each syllable rising like sparks from the furnaces. The workers nearby stared at us unaware, still shaping the war plate destined for distant crusades. The scent of promethium hung thick enough to taste. Outside, the sirens began to keen. The kind that aren't drills, the kind that tell you the sky itself has turned against you. I tried to contact the central data vault, but the VoxNet was collapsing into fragments, words spliced with screams, the occasional command buried in noise. Someone shouted for evacuation corridors. Someone else countermanded, demanding defense lines instead. The hierarchy had already fractured. It always does when the end descends from orbit faster than faith can adapt. I thought of the engines below the surface, the reactors that powered this city's heart, and wondered whether they too had heard the order. Whether they would mourn. The lumen hum returned, but weaker now, unsteady. The machine spirits were panicking. I whispered the litany of reassurance, my voice shaking as I pressed my mechadendrites to the control altar. For a moment I felt them calm, a flicker of trust through the data link, the way one might comfort a wounded animal. But in the deeper circuits there was still a faint echo, repeating in perfect cadence, Exterminatus confirmed. Over and over, as though the world itself were reminding me that obedience was already obsolete. When I emerged onto the upper gantry, I saw the horizon burning. Not yet from bombardment, but from the skies themselves. Atmospheric friction boiling against something descending. Ships, perhaps, or weapons. The manufactorum's smoke mixed with cloud fire, creating a red haze that swallowed the sun. Halix had joined the others at the platform, eyes upturned, mouth moving in silent logic strings. Some prayed, some cursed, and one, an overseer named Drain, tried to rally the workers into formation. But what formation can stand against a decree of annihilation? Even the Skitarii units patrolling the causeways moved with uncertainty, their targeting arrays flickering, as if confused by the contradiction of orders. Protect the Manufactorum. Evacuate the Manufactorum. Destroy the Manufactorum. A low boom rolled across the plains. The ground shook. Somewhere far to the north, the void shields had ignited, perhaps to ward off an attack, perhaps as an act of defiance before death. I felt the vibration through my boots, the tremor carrying through the reinforced girders into the core of my chest. The lumen hum faltered again. In that heartbeat of silence, I thought of Terra, of the Emperor's light shining across the void, and wondered whether he could see us even now, or whether his gaze had already moved on. Hallex turned to me. "The order's real," he said, voice barely audible over the rising static. "Confirmed through the astropathic choir. They're sealing the ports, then we're trapped," he nodded, "unless we find another way. The Magos Primus, he'll have directives." We descended into the inner sanctum through corridors that dripped condensation and machine oil. The sound of distant detonations followed like footsteps. When we reached the control pulpit, the Magos was already there, surrounded by data slates and servo skulls. His voice was calm, almost detached as he relayed final instructions. Maintain containment of the plasma cores. Preserve sacred schematics for transmission. Do not allow unauthorized access to the data vaults. I stepped forward. "Magos, the order, what are we to—" He raised one bionic hand. "We are to continue function until cessation of system integrity. But that means—" "Yes," he said simply. "Until the end." The words landed heavier than the tremors. Around us, servitors hummed, unblinking, still performing their endless loops. The machine spirits obeyed because that is all they know. And perhaps in that moment I envied them. They would not question. They would not fear. When I left the sanctum, the corridor lights were flickering in rhythmic spasms, each flash cutting the world into frames. In one, Hallex's face was visible, tense and pale. In the next, only shadow. I could hear the distant vox chatter of Skitarii squads, the click of boots and the faint hum of lascarbines charging. Somewhere a woman was weeping, somewhere else a hymn rose, a soft, broken tune about deliverance that no one truly believed in anymore. The sky thundered again, closer this time. The first bombardments had begun. The first strike did not land on us. It landed somewhere beyond the refinery stacks where the desert turned to vitrified glass, and the pressure wave followed like a herald. It rattled the gratings and threw a halo of dust from every bolt head, a fine powder that turned my tongue metallic when I breathed. The lumen hum shivered into a higher register, then steadied as if the Manufactorum had decided to pretend nothing had changed. I clung to that pretense for the length of a heartbeat. Pretense snapped when a section of the eastern gantry tore free and fell like a broken jaw, its teeth of rebar gnashing at the air before the impact swallowed its scream. I ran inventories with my mechadendrites as I moved, counting lives by the glow of their locator tags and power cells, men and women. A few youths pressed into shifts when the quotas tightened. All of them numbers to the system, yet the numbers bled. Brother Hallex stayed close, his augmetic ear cocked to the vox like a hound to a distant horn. Between the shearing sounds of distant infrastructure failing, I heard commands that contradicted themselves, sometimes in the same breath. Hold the line, collapse the line, redirect the line into the tunnels. I wondered if command had split into factions, or if the astropathic echoes carried ghost orders from hours ago when reason still imagined a tomorrow. We cut across a catwalk that stank of hot lubricant and fear. Overseer Drain was there, chopping the air with his baton, trying to herd workers toward the assembly musters. Form up, keep moving, he shouted, and for a second I could almost believe formation could knit the world together again. Then a second strike stroked the horizon with light so white it ate the color from everything, and the air arrived late, slamming us against the handrails hard enough to bruise. Drain staggered, regained his footing, and squared his shoulders like a man determined to be a statue when the city turned to dust. "Engin's here," he said to me through clenched teeth. "Confirm. Are we under local siege or total sanction?" I tasted promethium and old prayers. "Total," I answered. The word was spoken. Something in his eyes settled, not acceptance so much as a reclassification of reality. He nodded once, as if I had told him a delivery would be late. "Then order is mercy," he said, and waved his baton. "Seal the South Habs," I almost protested, then swallowed it, because protest would not change the sky. Helix swore in Binharik under his breath, an old cant of frustration elders used when servo arms misthreaded. We moved because movement felt like life. A squad of Skitarii intersected us at the next junction, their oculars bright with targeting runes, optics reflecting the reforged sun. Their Alpha's Vox grill crackled. "By command of the garrison, civilian flow is to be diverted from Port Heliot. Quarantine protocols enacted. Confirm and comply." "Port Heliot's void locks are sealed," Halleck said. "There's nowhere to go." "Confirm and comply," the Alpha repeated, as if the words themselves could build an exit where there was none. I opened a maintenance panel and kissed the cog embossed beneath the grime. Inside, the conduits carried the manufactorum's nervous system. Copper veins, ceramic insulation, beads of condensation trembling with each distant detonation. I palmed a breaker and redirected power to the western shutters to buy those corridors a sliver more time. It was a betrayal of the Magos' priority list, and I felt it like a warmth on my cheeks. A small sin paid in lumens. The hab doors groaned as they lowered. Through the narrowing slit I saw faces. A woman with a cracked rebreather clutching a child whose eyes were raw with smoke. A man with a fractured auspex clamped in white knuckles. Two habwives gripping the same prayer rope until their knuckles blanched. They did not shout. They made no accusations. They only looked at me as if the sign I traced over the panel could bless them into air. The door sealed with the finality of a tomb. A child's hand was not caught. I thanked every minor saint of machine precision for that mercy. Halix put a hand to the wall as if he could feel their pulse through the ceramite. He did not look at me when he said, "If the order is absolute, closing them buys them minutes rather than oblivion." "Minutes are a currency," I said, and heard how thin my voice sounded. We slipped into the service tunnels that ran beneath the crucibles, where the steam coiled like living things and every footfall set off a rain of condensed water. The lumen strips here were old and stingy with light, each ignition preceded by a reluctant buzz that reminded me of breath drawn through broken teeth. I let the machine spirit know we were not invaders. It answered with a grudging flicker. In the dimness, the world seemed quieter, but it was a lie. The bombardment had become a drumbeat we carried inside our ribs. Magos Primus ordered preservation of schematics, Halleck said, more to the hallway than to me. "Transmission when the window opens." "If a window opens," I said, and regretted it immediately, because speaking the doubt made it form up like a soldier in my mind. We came upon a maintenance alcove cradling 3 serfs in gray fatigues, huddled around a data slate whose cracked screen kept trying and failing to display an evacuation plan. One of them looked up, eyes glazed, and thrust the slate toward me. "Engines here, the Vox says there's safe passage through Ventral 8. The map I saw the timestamp. The route had existed 3 hours ago, before the last void shield surge burned out the relay junctions along that spine. Ventral 8 is gone," I said, and watched hope fail in the man's face like a lumen strip giving up the ghost. I almost added something soothing and meaningless, then chose a different offering. There's a crawl space under the slag conveyors. It will stink and it will burn, but the heat shielding is denser there. If you keep to the left at the sump ladder, you can reach the recycling cistern. There's water. It will boil later. It is cooler now. They stared, translating my mercy into movement. Move, I said. And this time I sounded like someone who believed commands could matter. We kept descending. Somewhere above, the Skitari's clipped cadence faded into the babble of Astra Militarum orders. The bark of officers attempting to stretch discipline over panic like a thread over a chasm. I knew those voices. I had wired their Vox grills, tuned their microbeads, watched them drink machine cant like it was just another ration they could stomach or reject. War came to the manufactorum every day in the form of quotas and requisitions. Today, war was the air. We reached the feeder line to the plasma cores and felt their heat before the lumen strips admitted us. Engine chambers always feel like heart chambers to me. Great organs beating not for blood but for purpose. I laid my palm to the control altar and whispered. The machine spirits were frantic, scattered like a choir thrown out of time by a conductor who left the stage mid-hymn. I coaxed them back toward tempo, promising them continuity for as long as function allowed. The cores replied with a steadying throb that soothed a corner of my mind I had not realized was sobbing. Halix stood watch, auspex raised, listening for human footsteps in a world increasingly inhabited by noise. I found an encrypted band, he said. It's low. Could be spillover from the choir, could be something else. Translate. It repeats a string that looks like a schematic call number, but it's wrong. Inked where I'd expect a sigil, there's a name. He paused, then let the word out as if it might whistle the air sharp enough to cut us. Haliand, the name hung. I knew it, though not from any current roster. Haliand was the designation of a vessel that had been decommissioned before my posting. A rumor among the night shift adepts that a hold long ago sealed had never been fully emptied. It was just a story, a means for junior techs to frighten each other into checking their seals. Impossible. Yet here it was, riding the encrypted undercurrent like a fishbone lodged in a throat. Source? I asked. Triangulating, Halix said, and his augmetic ear twitched. Undergrid. Old. If it's genuine, it's transmitting from somewhere beneath the vent sluices. That sector's been redlined since the last quake. The manufactorum shuddered. Not from the sky this time, but from something very near. A bite taken from the foundations, a collapse we could feel but not see. Dust came down in a soft veil. The lumen hum stuttered, then steadied, then stuttered again. It felt like a decision. We can ignore it, I said, because someone had to voice the most rational choice. We can obey Magos Primus, tend the cores, preserve the designs, and die in good order. And they will name a pipe after us in some other manufactorum, Halix said, not unkindly. Or, I said, and the word was a hinge that swung every thought I had into a new corridor. We trace that name and find out whether the dead remember a door. Halix looked at me the way one looks at a faulty gauge. Suspicious, hoping for recalibration, dreading confirm. If it's a lure, then the machine spirits will watch our backs while we're devoured. He almost smiled. Almost. Then the Vox cracked with a burst of clarity so sudden it felt obscene. The encrypted band sang a single phrase, clean as a blade. Heliand. Ventral sluice 12. Mercy is not a function. We stood in the engine heart, ringed by heat and wind and the patient endurance of machines built to outlast men, and listened to a ghost tell us where to die. The bombardment's drumbeat synchronized with my pulse. The lumen hum purred in my bones like a distant animal deciding whether to trust the hand that fed it. I touched the control altar one last time, a brief benediction, and pulled my hand away as if from a friend I would not see again. Ventral sluice 12, Halix said. Undergrid, I said. End of function, he said. Or beginning of a different one, I said. And we turned toward a stairwell that smelled of salt, rust, and old promises. The stairwell descended in spirals so tight the lumen strips blurred into a helix of fading light. Each step groaned beneath the weight of history, dust spilling from seams that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The bombardment's rhythm had become constant now, a slow, dreadful heartbeat echoing through the planet's bones. I could feel it through the rail, each vibration crawling up into my arm, a reminder that everything above us was dying by measured degrees. Helix moved ahead, his augmetic eye cutting a narrow beam through the gloom, illuminating rusted sigils, half-eaten cables, and the faint trace of Mechanicus glyphs long since forgotten. The words here were archaic, carved during a different age of doctrine. Even my translator spirit hesitated to interpret them, whispering half-meanings like ghosts reluctant to speak. We reached the bottom landing and found the gate, a vast, circular door half swallowed by sediment and corrosion. The designation Ventral Sluice 12 was still visible, etched in metal so thick it seemed defiant of time. I approached the control altar beside it, brushing away centuries of grime until the sacred runes beneath began to glow faintly. The interface resisted my first touch, then yielded with a reluctant sigh. Power returned to the mechanism in slow pulses, the hum of awakening systems trembling through the deck, like the breath of a sleeper disturbed from long hibernation. The lumen hum, my old companion, returned, weaker but familiar. For the first time since the word Exterminatus had echoed through the vox, I felt something like control. Pressure locks engaged, Helix murmured, scanning the conduits. This line isn't part of the current grid. It's older, pre-standard manufacturum layout, maybe pre-imperial integration. Helliant, I said softly, as though naming it could make sense of the unease coiling in my gut. He nodded. If the signal's real, it's coming from the other side of this gate. The door began to move, gears grinding like reluctant confession. Steam burst from the seams, filling the stairwell with a hiss that stung the lungs. When it finally opened enough for us to pass, the stench hit first. Stale oil, ozone, and something else beneath it. Something organic and faintly sweet, like rot concealed under metal. Beyond the threshold stretched a tunnel wider than any I'd expected, lined with thick conduits that pulsed with dim power. The light here was not lumen white but amber, the color of dying suns. I stepped through, mechadendrites extended, and the air felt heavier, denser, as if the weight of secrecy itself pressed against us. We advanced in silence for several minutes, guided only by the faint beacon on Helix's auspex. The walls were covered in script, lines of binary interwoven with fragments of what might once have been prayers. The deeper we went, the more the air grew charged until my augmetic joints began to itch from residual static. Then the vox on Helix's belt came alive again. One single tone, drawn out and thin, followed by a whisper. Function persists. Mercy is not a function, I froze. The voice was human, or had once been. It was distorted by interference, but I could hear the cadence of ritual in it. The calm certainty of someone reciting a litany rather than speaking freely. Identify, I demanded into the vox. This is Engenseer Loran of Manufactorum Hestia Prime. Who transmits on this band? The reply came slow, each word trailing static. Hellion does not transmit. Held receives, then silence. Even the hum of the conduit seemed to still, as if the world itself was listening. Helix looked at me, face pale in the dim glow. Receiving what? He asked. I didn't answer, because the same question had already hollowed itself into my thoughts. We pressed on. The tunnel ended in a chamber vast enough to house a lander. Rows of inert servitors lined the walls like statues awaiting purpose. At the far end stood a massive archway of blackened steel, half collapsed under its own weight, and before it, a vessel. Small, wedge-shaped, its hull covered in Mechanicus insignia so faded they looked like shadows. The name Heliand was engraved along its prow. Letters filled with dust. I felt a pull in my chest, a mingling of dread and awe. It shouldn't have been here. Nothing this intact should have survived the decades of corrosion or neglect. Yet its power core hummed faintly, like a heart that refused to stop beating. Halleck stepped forward, scanning the readouts. It's powered. Emperor preserve us, it's powered. Barely, but enough for ignition. Impossible, I said, though I could see the truth reflected in the glow of its running lights. This craft was decommissioned before the current century. He gave me a look caught between fear and exhilaration. Maybe no one told it that. We approached the boarding ramp, which extended at our presence with the smooth precision of a living thing. I hesitated at the base, every instinct torn between reverence and terror. The vox crackled again, a fragment of that same voice. Witness required. Memory must be carried. Then the ramp lights shifted from amber to crimson and the hatch hissed open. Inside, the air was cooler, cleaner, tinged with ozone and faint incense. The corridors were narrow, lined with cogitator panels whose screens flickered with streams of code. I could hear something deeper within, the pulse of an active machine spirit aware of us waiting. When we reached the central chamber, I understood what Heliand truly was. Not a transport, not a warship, a reliquary. Rows of stasis caskets lined the walls, each containing fragments of data, shards of crystalline memory cores, sealed vials of what might have been holy oils or bio-coded essence. At the center stood a sarcophagus of black adamantine, its surface carved with thousands of tiny prayers. Halix whispered, "It's a vault, a backup of the world." I felt my throat tighten. Preservation against erasure. Above the sarcophagus, a single lumen burned blue, the only light of that color I had seen since the sky died. Beneath it, an inscription, to be awakened when silence becomes the only truth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The bombardment thundered distantly, yet here it felt muffled like sound trapped behind glass. I realized the hum that filled the chamber was the same note that had haunted my bones since morning. Quieter now, but constant. The world's pulse, the manufactorum's final heartbeat. Halix turned to me, voice low. "If this is what the signal wanted us to find, what do we do with it?" I looked at the sarcophagus, then at the rows of frozen data around it, and felt something old awaken in me. Something neither logic nor doctrine could name. "We remember," I said. "We bear witness, and when the fire comes, we make sure this memory does not die with us." Outside, the tremors deepened. Somewhere above, the first orbital lances pierced the crust. The lumen flickered, and for the briefest instant the hum rose in pitch, as though the manufactorum itself was crying out. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the sarcophagus and whispered a final blessing. Then the ground split open, and the world began to fall. When I surfaced from the tunnels, the world had already begun to unmake itself. The sky, once red with industry, had turned the color of molten iron. Ash fell like snow, drifting slow and quiet over wrecked spires and collapsing hab blocks. The manufactorum's eastern wing was gone. Nothing but a glowing trench filled with twisted steel and flickering ghosts of machinery that still tried to function. The bombardment hadn't ceased. It had become rhythm. Each impact rolled through the ground like the pulse of some monstrous heart buried deep beneath us, beating to remind us what dying truly sounded like. Halix limped behind me, a strip of metal shrapnel lodged in his calf. His augmetics had gone dull, the red glow of his optics fading to ember. We'd sealed the entrance behind us, though we both knew it was pointless. The Helian's chamber would not survive the next barrage. It didn't matter. We'd copied what we could, the memory cores, the encrypted data spirits, and loaded them into a portable drive slung across my chest. It was small, no larger than a human heart. Fitting, I thought. A world's heart in a shell of adamantine. We emerged into what remained of the central square. The statue of the Omnissiah had collapsed, the head sheared off, its hand still raised in benediction over a crowd that no longer existed. A squad of Astra Militarum soldiers was stationed nearby, their uniforms scorched and their commander shouting orders through a Vox grill clogged with static. His voice broke like glass with every syllable. Civilians clustered behind them, faces hidden beneath soot and fear, clinging to whatever relics they could carry. Prayer charms, fragments of machine casing. One even held the broken arm of a servitor as though it might still offer protection. A trooper waved his laser gun at us. "Clear the way! Tech priests have no clearance here." Hallex raised his credentials, his voice calm despite the shaking in his hands. "We serve the manufactorum. We have orders from Magos Primus." The commander turned, eyes hollow. "Magos Primus is dead. The command spire took a lance hit an hour ago. There's nothing left to serve." The words hit harder than the shockwave that followed. The Magos gone. The one constant in the structure of obedience erased in a blink. I felt the chain of hierarchy crumble inside me like a failing circuit. "Then who gives the orders now?" I asked. The commander laughed, a dry, broken sound. "The sky does." Hallex looked to me as though waiting for permission to believe it. I said nothing. What words could oppose the truth when truth came from orbit? We tried to move toward the port districts following the river of displaced workers. But the checkpoints had turned into cages. The Astra Militarum had been ordered to hold the perimeter, but hold meant containment. Anyone who crossed the wrong boundary was shot, not out of cruelty but necessity. Even mercy had a schedule now. I could hear the heavy boots of commissars pacing the barricades, their voices reciting liturgies of discipline to keep their own fear from breaking through. Obedience is the armor of faith. Disobedience is treason. Treason burns. The words had lost all rhythm, repeated too often, half swallowed by ash. We passed a row of hab workers kneeling before a shattered shrine, their faces lit by the dim flicker of a dying lumen. A priest in a tattered robe stood above them, swinging a censer that exhaled smoke thick with recited scripture. His eyes were hollow, his words mechanical. "The Emperor's light is not extinguished. The Emperor's mercy is the fire that cleanses." The worshippers didn't answer. Some wept. Some stared blankly at the ground. One whispered something that sounded like a child's name. I wanted to stop to tell them the truth, that mercy was not coming, but my tongue refused to shape the words. Even blasphemy felt like wasted breath. The ash deepened, clogging my filters. Every inhalation brought the taste of iron and burnt flesh. The Vox relays above the square emitted bursts of binary code, fragmented beyond meaning. Occasionally a single human word slipped through: evacuate, containment, detonation, like prayers to a god who'd stopped listening. Hallex leaned heavily on his staff, his augmetic leg dragging, sparks falling with every step. We reached the barricade at the edge of Port Heliot, or what remained of it. The once mighty void locks were sealed under mountains of debris, their golden Aquila insignias half melted, dripping like tears of metal. A column of refugees had gathered before the entrance, shouting, begging, some pounding their fists against the sealed gates until the flesh split. The soldiers held them back with rifle butts and blunt warnings. I could see the desperation in their eyes, the same desperation that haunted mine. Each of us clung to a lie of survival, as if belief itself could conjure a ship from the ashes. Hallex whispered beside me, "We can't stay here." The next bombardment, a flare burst across the horizon and the sentence drowned in thunder. The ground heaved, tossing bodies like debris. I hit the deck, shielding the drive with my arms. The explosion's heat washed over us so intense it felt like the air itself was burning. When I lifted my head, the world had turned white. The barricade, the soldiers, the refugees, all reduced to silhouettes of ash frozen mid-motion. Only the nearest figures had form left, their armor melted into their flesh. The void gates glowed, molten and screaming. Hallex was on his knees, coughing, his mechanical limbs twitching. I hauled him to his feet, ignoring the pain in my shoulder. "We have to move." "Where?" he rasped. "There's nowhere left." I looked up at the burning sky. The orbital fire had intensified. Ribbons of plasma cutting through the clouds like veins of light. Somewhere above, an Imperial cruiser was executing the will of the High Lords, burning a world to save the Imperium. I wondered if they could see us down here. Tiny figures scrambling in the inferno, still pretending that movement meant defiance. "The undergrid still exists," I said. "There are maintenance conduits that lead beyond the city. If the bombardment pattern follows protocol, the outer wastelands will burn last. Maybe we die slower." Hallex finished, but he followed me anyway. We wove through the ruins, past the shadows of what had been lives. Every step took us closer to the river that cut through the Manufactorum district. Its surface boiled, sending up clouds of steam that glowed red under the bombardment. I remembered how it used to look, dark and sluggish with industrial waste carrying the reflection of the assembly spires. Now it looked alive, writhing under the fire of the skies. We found a gap in the collapsed wall of a hab block and slipped inside. The air within was staler but cooler, the walls humming faintly with residual power. The corridor was lined with pick screens displaying propaganda feeds that had somehow survived the chaos. They still played the same looped message, "Glory to the Emperor. Trust in his will." The voice was serene, untouched by fear. I wanted to tear the screens down, but Hallex stopped me. "Let them speak," he said. "It's better than silence." So we sat in the flickering light, two figures of soot and metal surrounded by the voice of a dead world still preaching obedience. I looked at the drive in my lap, its red indicator blinking softly. Inside it were fragments of everything our world had been, designs, histories, the recorded hymns of machine spirits, maybe even memories of the people now reduced to ash. I thought of the Helian's voice. Witness required. Perhaps this was the witness. Perhaps survival wasn't about the body, but the memory it carried. Outside, the bombardment roared again, closer this time, so close the walls vibrated like drumskins. The lumen hum, faint but steady, resonated in the floor beneath us. I could feel it through my palms, steady, defiant. The world was dying, but its heart was still beating. We waited only long enough for the shaking to ease, then pushed deeper through the hab block's innards until we found a maintenance hatch that hadn't collapsed. The handle was hot enough to sting through my glove. I muttered apology to the guardian spirit and forced it. The panel complained, then swung wide, and a throat of darkness yawned beyond. The lumen hum rose through the floor like a tired breath. I took it into my own chest and matched my pulse to it. A childish trick I'd taught myself as an apprentice. Whenever the engine sounded like thunder and discipline sounded like a slide, the tunnel spat us out near a transit causeway, where the Astra Militarum had dug in around a pair of autocannon nests. They had sandbagged a shrine cart and used devotional banners as windbreaks. The saints stared down at us through soot. A commissar stood in the center of the road as if he were a statue bolted there. His cap burned, his greatcoat rimed with ash. He watched civilians file into a fenced lane that led to the lower decks of Port Heliot, now a charnel labyrinth of sealed bulkheads and glowing seams. The guardsmen around him moved like men who had decided to be gears. "Engine seers," he said as we approached, his vox grill translating the ruin of his throat into something level. "Your district is under terminal sanction. Civilians will be kept from the blast corridors for their own mercy. Any attempt to breach the locks is treason." His eyes flicked to the drive at my chest. What you carry is to be surrendered for central collation. Halleck stiffened, but I squeezed his sleeve. By whose authority? By the Emperor's, he said without hesitation. And for a heartbeat I envied the purity of that answer. He gestured. 2 troopers stepped forward. The pressure of their hands on my arms unlocked an old memory. My apprenticeship oath, palm on a cold altar, promising to preserve knowledge even against the wishes of fools and kings, because machine truth outlasts both. I looked at the queue inside the fence. A woman in a smelter apron was whispering into a child's hair. A miner held his helmet against his ribs like a reliquary. The fence was made of rebar and wire twisted in haste. The wire had cut a groove into the paint on the shrine cart, exposing rust like dried blood. "Commissar," I said, and kept my voice even. "If you collate this drive, it will vanish into the chain and burn with the rest. Grant me an escort to the undergrid. There's a conduit that can throw a signal past the atmospheric boil for a while yet. We can transmit this world before it ends." He considered me with an animal stillness. Beyond him a lance fell somewhere inland, a needle of light sowing new fire into the horizon. "You ask me to loosen order when order is all that keeps these people from tearing each other apart. I ask you to let one thing escape the pattern." His jaw worked. In the moment before he answered, my microbade clicked with the clean sound of a private channel opening, and a strain of Binaric threaded into my ear like a secret spoke for my throat alone. "Engineer Loran, if you carry the heart, aim it to Vox Point series in the South Utilities. I can give you a window." Hallex heard it too. His augmetic ear twitched. I kept my face a mask and answered in a pulse-spare cadence no layman would read. "Identify." "Engineer Militant Moret, Ring Sector 3, the voice replied, formal even through the suffocation of static. "I am alive for the moment. I am also in violation of 36 protocols. There is a working uplink in series. The power is intermittent. The coolant lines are singing. If you bring the memory, we can make the sky remember, if only for a breath." "Why contact us?" I asked. "Because you're moving," Murray said and broke the channel. The commissar's gaze sharpened a fraction, the way a blade decides to be a blade. "Your answer?" I lifted the drive's cable so he could see the inscription etched along its case. A prayer I had cut there as a joke the year I made rank. "Function recalls the maker." It looked like courage when I held it up. Really, it was only the most honest thing I possessed. "If you take this, you will have obeyed. If you let me pass, something of your world will exist when the ash cools. Choose which comfort you want." He stared as if a calculus he knew by heart had grown a new term. Then he nodded to the troopers to release my arms. "You have one escort," he said. "Not for your sake, for the Emperor's record." A young guardsman stepped out of line. His nameplate read Sivan. He couldn't have been more than 19. His eyes were the gray of quenched steel, and the lenses of his rebreather were fogged with breath. He said nothing, which I respected. The commissar lifted a hand. "Seal the lane," he called, and the rebar fence swung shut with a noise like a sigh that had learned to wear boots. Inside the pen, people pressed forward as if proximity to the lock could argue with reality. "Open the lower hatches." A woman cried. "My son is inside." "Order is mercy," a trooper repeated, and I knew he hated the feel of the words in his mouth, the way they dragged their nails down the throat on the way out. Halix touched my shoulder. "Ceres is south. 2 levels down. The coolant maze." "The coolant maze," I echoed, and the lumen hum underfoot changed key as if to answer, the faintest brightening in the bones of the floor. We moved. Sivan took point. He had the gait of a man trying to remember every field drill at once, every corner a lesson, every step a test. The city writhed around us, a living schematic in the act of being crossed out. We cut through a transit bay where chimera hulls lay overturned, their tracks still hot. A pair of Medici knelt between them, hands deep in a man whose abdomen had become a geography of wrongness. One looked up at me and mouthed something I couldn't hear. I blessed the machine spirits of their tools and did not turn my head to see if it helped. The bombardment pressed closer. Light arrived first, a silent blade that cut our shadows away. Sound followed like the fist. A spire toppled in the distance with the inevitability of a story that refuses revision. My filters choked. Ash crept through their mesh and painted the back of my throat with grit and old fire. Halleck stumbled, caught himself with his staff, and forced a grin that looked like a crack opening in stone. "If Moret lied," he panted, "I will file a complaint." "Please do," I said. I would enjoy the paperwork. The joke was a thread. We held it while we could. We slid past a barricade where the last of a platoon held against nothing at all, firing into heat haze because the rhythm steadied their hands. An officer with lacquered laurels shouted a battle cry that belonged to another war on another day. I did not tell him the enemy was gravity and instruction. I have learned the limits of correction. At last the vents began to breathe cold through the floor gratings, tasting of copper and algae and antique brine. South Utilities. The tunnels narrowed, the serenity of old engineering returning in the simplicity of their angles. The lumen strips here were blue and stingy. Their song was a thin, exact treble that threaded between my ribs. We passed a line of dripping condensers and a mural someone had chalked on the wall years ago. A cog crowned with a sun. I touched it as we went, and calcified chalk shed onto my glove like dry snow. Ceres announced itself with a roar. Coolant lines thrummed so loud it felt like being inside a throat halfway between a sob and a hymn. Steam rose in veils, warm enough to sting. 3 of the regulator stacks had ruptured. Green liquid foamed and hissed where it met hot decking. In the center of the chamber, a Vox spire leaned like a crippled saint. Its antennae snapped. Its dish half melted into a weeping lip of metal. A figure worked at its base, knee-deep in coolant, shoulder-deep in guilt, hands a blur in the spray. Moret. He looked older than the name in my head, though we were likely the same age. His scalp ports were black with grime, and a strip of bandage crossed his brow like a failed oath. He glanced up once when he heard us and nodded as if we had always been part of the equation. "You brought it," he said, and the sentence carried thank you, apology, and confession in equal parts. "Window?" I asked. 2, maybe 3, he said, and held up fingers slick with green. "Minutes if we convince the spirit to sing through a throat full of knives." He tossed me a fiber bundle. "Patch this into your heart." I knelt at the relay altar, the drive's weight suddenly enormous against my sternum. The lumen hum in the floor settled as if gathering itself. Hallex limped to the bypass valves and began to chant, his voice a scarred rhythm the machine would recognize. Sivan took a position at the door, rifle up, eyes white with steam. Moret pressed his ear to the spire's casing like a priest listening for penance, then slammed a fist into a panel that had forgotten it could open. "Ready?" I said, and fed the first stream. The chamber answered with a scream of binary that tasted like copper and memory on my tongue. Lines of schematics poured through. Hymns, the names of the dead, the angles of our towers in winter light, the slow diary of a planet that had believed itself ordinary. The uplink stuttered, caught, shoved itself forward another inch. I bled power from non-essentials, dimming the room until faces were chiaroscuro masks. Somewhere overhead something large fell a long way. "We have it," Moret said. "We have it." The floor bucked. A fissure tore through the decking between us and cold green vomited upward in a sheet. The Vox spire groaned. Its top half tilted, casting a crooked shadow that crossed my hands and settled like a verdict. "Hold it," I said to nobody and everybody, and the drive's indicator blinked frantic red as if it could pray. The uplink signal bar climbed one last notch, thin as a hair. Then a shape filled the doorway behind Sivan, a silhouette broader than a guardsman, taller than any Mechanicus adepts I had served beside, its presence quiet as judgment, Sivan whispered, not over Vox but from somewhere behind his teeth, by the throne. The shape stepped into the steam, and the light caught on Oramite like a dawn we did not deserve. The steam parted around him as if even vapor recognized its betters. Oramite, dulled by soot yet unmistakable, framed a figure both terrible and sanctified. A custodian guard stood before us, the gold of his armor scorched black in places, the eagle wings of his crest half melted, but his stance as unbroken as scripture. I had seen pict feeds of his kind, idols of loyalty, guardians of the Emperor himself, but never one in the flesh. Here in the ruins of a dying manufactorum, his presence felt both impossible and inevitable, like a final inspection before judgment. Hallex froze mid-chant, his mechadendrites curling like frightened serpents. Sivan lowered his weapon out of pure awe, not obedience. Merritt bowed his head, coolant dripping from his sleeves. I could only stare. The custodian's eyes, dark and unreadable behind his helm lenses, fixed on the Vox spire, then on me. When he spoke, his voice carried through the chamber not as sound but as decree. Calm, unhurried, vast. You are transmitting. Yes, I said, my throat dry. The memory of this world, its work, its people. The order forbids transmission, he replied, though not with the tone of accusation, more like a reminder of the natural laws that govern gravity and flame. Exterminatus decrees silence. Then why are you here? Halex's voice cracked halfway between plea and defiance. To silence us? The custodian turned slightly, the motion slow, deliberate, and in that moment I understood how a single movement could carry centuries of discipline. I was here before the decree, he said. The vessel Heliand, it was placed under my watch. You have entered sacred ground, tech priests. You have disturbed a charge I was sworn to protect. The vault, I murmured. You were guarding it, he nodded once. For remembrance. For witness. Merritt wiped a sleeve across his brow. Then help us. We're trying to fulfill that charge. The memory's ready. The uplink's active for another minute. The custodian's head tilted, the faint whir of servos marking the motion. The Emperor's will is not preservation. It is purification. Purification through erasure? I said, and the words left my mouth before reason could silence them. If nothing remains, then what was purified? What was learned? The Omnissiah teaches that even failure is data, even destruction a form of knowledge. Enough. The word carried no anger, only authority, and it cut through the air like the edge of a blade. He stepped closer, towering over me. The heat of the coolant steam refracted against his armor, turning the gold into halos of bleeding light. I have stood before the throne, he said softly. I have heard the silence that sustains all things. You cannot comprehend what must be done. Then let us try, I whispered, because comprehension is all we have left. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, to my astonishment, he stepped aside. Just one step, but it was enough. The signal resumed, a tremor running through the uplink as data surged upward into the void. The hum deepened, resonating through the deck and the walls, through our bones. I felt it align with the same rhythm that had haunted me since dawn, the pulse of the dying world, now beating in unison with the machine. For a fleeting moment I believed we might actually succeed. Then the spire screamed. Its upper half tore free, sheared by a shockwave from above. The blast hurled me backward into the coolant pool, searing heat clawing at my flesh. The chamber filled with fire and sound. Merritt vanished behind a wall of steam. Halex's voice shouted my name, then cut short with a noise that could have been prayer or death. The custodian stood unmoving amid the chaos, his armor absorbing the storm like a relic refusing to kneel. When I dragged myself upright, the spire was gone, replaced by a column of molten ruin. The uplink was severed, The drive in my chest flickered weakly, its glow fading. I didn't know if the transmission had escaped, if any signal had pierced the inferno of orbit. All I knew was that something inside the custodian had changed. His weapon hung at his side untouched. His gaze lifted toward the fractured ceiling where fragments of the sky burned. "The decree is complete," he said quietly. Yet I remain. "Then help me," I rasped. "If there's any way to—" He turned his head just enough for me to see the reflection of the flames in his visor. "You have already done more than you were permitted," he said. "Now you must do what none of us were allowed." "What is that?" "Remember." He reached out one gauntleted hand and touched the side of my helm. For a moment the world narrowed to the weight of his palm and the hum of the lumen beneath my skin. I felt something transfer. Data, memory, blessing, or curse, I couldn't tell. When he withdrew, his voice came softer still, almost human. "Go to the surface. The fire will not be long." And then he was gone, stepping through the coolant haze, vanishing into the roar of the dying machine. Whether he walked into death or ascension, I never learned. I only knew that I had been dismissed, and that dismissal felt like absolution. I found Hallex amid the wreckage, burned but breathing. Merritt was gone, swallowed by the coolant pool, leaving only ripples where the foam had boiled away. Zivan knelt beside him. His armor cracked, his rifle melted into slag. He looked at me without words, then nodded, a soldier's final acknowledgement. Together we began to climb, back through the tunnels, back toward the light that was no longer sky but flame. As we ascended, the heat grew unbearable. The air roared like a furnace, every breath a wound. But through it all, beneath the thunder and collapse, I could still hear it, the hum. Weak, fading, but there. The world's last heartbeat. When we reached the surface, the city was gone. Only a wasteland of molten glass stretched to the horizon, reflecting the fire of orbiting ships. The bombardment had become a sun in itself, a crown of annihilation. Hallex fell to his knees, his mechadendrites curling inward like dying vines. "So ends Hestia Prime," he said. "No," I answered, lifting the drive. "So it continues." I pressed the release, activating its self-encoding sequence. The shell split, releasing a shimmer of blue particles that rose into the superheated air. Data turned to light, memory turned to prayer. The ashes caught it and carried it upward, each spark rising toward the burning heavens. For a moment, even the fire seemed to pause. The glass plane still glowed beneath our feet long after the bombardment ceased. It pulsed with trapped heat, veins of red and gold snaking through its surface like molten arteries beneath translucent skin. The air was thick with a shimmer that distorted distance, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. There was no sound. No hum, no wind, no cry of surviving engines, only the ringing in my ears and the soft crackle of cooling stone. Silence, I realized, had texture. It pressed against the senses like weight. Hallex stumbled beside me, his robes fused to patches of melted ceramite. One eye darkened where its optic feed had shorted. His breathing was shallow, more rasp than rhythm. The heat rising from the ground made every movement feel like walking through breath itself. I half-dragged him toward the shadow of a collapsed transport whose hull had turned into a curved wall of glass, its edges still dripping. The shade it cast was illusory, but even the illusion of relief felt sacred. We had survived Exterminatus, or rather we had survived the first half of it. The second was slower, quieter, and in some ways crueler. Radiation, vacuum leaks, the gradual betrayal of air. This was not mercy. It was the echo of mercy, stretched thin until it became mockery. I thought of the custodian's final words. Remember. The simplicity of it stung, as though memory alone could shield against the death of a world, as though remembrance were anything but another form of burning. When the tremors finally subsided, I rose to check the drive's shell. The containment had fused into a solid lump of metal. Whatever fragments had uploaded to the void were beyond my reach now, carried upward by the storm of plasma and data. The rest was sealed, its contents entombed inside a heart that no tool I owned could open again. The weight of it felt both hollow and infinite. I carried it because my hands refused to let it go. Halix stirred. "Do you hear that?" At first I thought he meant the ringing, the silence, the ghosts of explosions that still trembled in our bones. But then I caught it too, a faint vibration beneath the glass, subtle as breath. A pulse. I knelt, pressing my palm to the surface. It was there, unmistakable. The hum impossibly deep beneath us, still alive. The manufacturum's buried reactors, or what was left of them, somehow impossibly they had not gone cold. "Underground systems," I said. "Still running." Halix's cracked lips moved around a sound that was half a laugh, half a cough. "A machine's refusal to die. We built them well." He was right, and yet the persistence of that hum unnerved me. Logic dictated that every conduit and reactor core within 100 kilometers had been vitrified or melted into slag. No power should have survived, not even residual heat, unless something below had sealed itself off, insulated by layers of archaic shielding, or perhaps something older. "We should find access," I said, scanning the horizon. The idea was madness, descending again into the ruins we had barely escaped. But madness and faith often share the same root. If the undergrid survived, there may be atmosphere pockets, supplies, communication lines. Halix gave a weary nod. "Lead on, then. I'll follow the sound." We moved across the glass plain, our reflections warped and elongated beneath us. Each step left faint indentations that closed behind, as if the world resented being touched. In the distance, black shapes rose from the shimmering horizon, twisted remnants of towers or ships that had fallen from orbit. The air smelled of ozone and minerals. Occasionally the wind carried whispers, the kind of auditory hallucinations that occur when nerves fray under stress. But sometimes they were words. Fragments of Vox transmissions echoing long after the senders had burned away. "Maintain order. Containment breach in. The Emperor protects ghosts of command." I wondered if the void could remember orders the way it remembered light. After an hour of walking, we found what we were looking for. A fissure in the glass, narrow but deep, exhaling faint warmth. The edges were smooth, melted by heat rather than fractured. Peering down, I saw darkness threaded with dim red veins, the glow of functioning systems far below. Halix smiled faintly. "Your hum again." I crouched, running my hand along the edge until I found a structural weakness. A section of glass gave way, collapsing inward to reveal a slope of fused metal and concrete. Heat surged upward, hot enough to sear exposed skin, but breathable. "Barely. We go down," I said. "Into the grave," Halix murmured. "Into the heart," I corrected. We descended, sliding on the molten slope until our boots struck solid ground. The air grew thicker, laced with the tang of oil and scorched polymer. The light dimmed until we could see only the red veins that pulsed along the walls, casting everything in a hellish glow. I activated my shoulder lumen, and the beam cut through the haze to reveal the remnants of a service corridor. The architecture was older, different from the manufactorum above. Smooth metal surfaces, less ornamented, more deliberate. It was as though we had stepped into a different era of construction, one that predated the city's Mechanicus integration. The hum grew stronger here, a low vibration that made the walls tremble with every pulse. Somewhere ahead something still lived. We followed the sound through winding tunnels until we reached a chamber the size of a cathedral. At its center stood a column of machinery, its surface etched with runes I didn't recognize. The air shimmered with residual energy. Conduits radiated outward like veins, disappearing into the walls. Around the base lay the remnants of servitors, their flesh long desiccated, their augmetics still twitching in slow, purposeless cycles. This isn't part of Hestia Prime's grid, Halix said. This is older. Look at the alloy composition. Non-standard ceramite blend, pre-imperial. I approached the column, tracing the runes with my fingertips. The characters were ancient, but the language was unmistakable. A dialect of Benharic so archaic it bordered on poetry. I began translating aloud, voice shaking with disbelief. The memory of flame shall be kept beneath iron. The witness of loss shall endure until the stars forget their names. Halix looked at me sharply. A preservation vault? Or a tomb, I said. The column's surface shifted at my touch, panels sliding aside with a hiss of vented steam. Inside, beneath layers of dust, a series of crystalline cores pulsed faintly. Not the cold light of power cells, but something deeper, richer. They throbbed in unison with the hum, slow, steady, alive. I reached out, hesitant, and the closest crystal flared brighter. A wave of static washed through the chamber. The vox beads in our ears crackled with sudden noise. Then through the interference, a voice whispered. Not the machine voice of an archive or spirit. Human, fragile, echoing across centuries. If you hear this, we are already ash. But ash remembers the fire that made it. Halix staggered back, his hand on his chest. Emperor's grace. The voice continued, weaving through the static like a confession. We built this vault beneath the manufactorum, not for protection, but remembrance. When the order comes, and it always comes, let this be what survives. Not the machine, not the flesh, but the echo of both. The crystals pulsed faster, synchronizing with the rhythm of the hum. I realized what we were hearing wasn't just recording. It was continuity. A consciousness stretched through the centuries, an echo that refused to fade. Halix met my gaze, his expression unreadable behind soot and exhaustion. Loran, we shouldn't have found this. Maybe it found us, I said. Above us, the ceiling groaned. Dust fell like fine snow. Somewhere distant, the bombardment resumed. A final cleansing pass. The world was ending for the second time. But below, beneath iron and glass, something still spoke. The light from the crystals had settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm by the time we caught our breath again. The glow painted the chamber in alternating shades of blood and amber, the sort of light you'd expect from a heartbeat made visible. Every pulse drew sweat from my skin and memory from my skull. I could feel thought itself slowing to match the machine's tempo. Halix slumped against a bulkhead. His breathing was ragged, wet. The burns on his side were deep enough that his robes clung to him like a second skin. You still mean to touch it? He asked. I already did, I said. It knows we're here. Then speak with it and be quick. The sky's falling again. He wasn't wrong. Faint tremors quivered through the walls like a distant organ playing the same final note over and over. I reached out to the nearest crystal. The surface was warm and slick as though it sweated energy. When my fingertips met it, the light brightened and a pressure pushed into my skull. It wasn't pain. It was memory, thick as resin. Images poured through the manufactorum in its youth. Towers unmarred, air filled with promise and exhaust. Children running between forges before curfew. Amagos teaching an apprentice to read the binary hymns without vocalizing, so the words would live entirely in the mind. The vision shifted, speeding through centuries. The first requisition of troops, the first rationing, the first prayer uttered not for hope, but for delay. And then the decree, the astropathic scream that broke the world's back.